All right. How's everyone doing? How was lunch? Great. It was good? Yeah, those were good. Those are some good sandwiches. Well, we have a fantastic speaker next for our first session after lunch, Dr. Antony Davies. Dr. Antony Davies is an associate professor of economics at Duquesne University and the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE. Dr. Davies has authored over 150 op-eds for, among others, The Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Forbes, Investors Business Daily, and the New York Daily News. He's a frequent lecturer at policy conferences on Capitol Hill, and his YouTube videos on economics and statistics have garnered millions of views. In addition to teaching at the undergraduate and PhD levels, Dr. Davies was Chief Financial Officer at Paragon Computation, Chief Analytics Officer at Replica, now IndiePub Games, President and co-founder of Paragon Software, and associate producer of Fish, How an Economy Grows, at the Moving Pictures Institute. He's also the co-host of Words with Numbers podcast, which dives into economics, political science, current events, and public policy with Dr. James Harrigan. And I definitely recommend that podcast if you're interested in learning more about economics. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Antony Davies.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I want to talk about a tale of two worlds. The world you live in and the world you think you live in. And the tale begins with the media, which is a profit-oriented entity. It seeks out viewers because it loves the viewers. Except it's not really the viewers it loves, it's the dollars that the viewers bring. And so if the media can attract the viewers, then the media gets more dollars, and this is very happy for the media. What is it that the viewers want from the media? What the viewers want is bad news. We love stories about death and destruction and pandemics and crashing economies. If you ask people, is this what you like? They say, no, I don't like that. In fact, I can't stand it that that's all I see on television. And yet, if you look at their behavior, this is what people go after. How do I know? CNN is the 24th most popular website in the United States. And if you go to CNN, you will see all sorts of news about bad things happening. There is a website, there are a couple of them. One of the more popular is goodnewsnetwork.org. And goodnewsnetwork.org only gives us good news. It is the 20,158th most popular website in the United States. There's a website, Is My Computer On? And if you go to Is My Computer On, you see this. In terms of internet traffic, Is My Computer On is a lot more like goodnewsnetwork.org than goodnewsnetwork.org is like CNN. By our behavior, we demonstrate that we want to hear bad news. And so, consequently, we end up believing what the media tells us. And I'm not claiming that the media lies. They tell us the truth, generally speaking. And it's understandable that we would believe what they tell us. But we go one step further, and we don't believe what the media doesn't tell us. And that creates a problem wherein we live in a different world than we think we live in because we only see half of the picture. We see the half that the media gives us because that's the half we want to see. So what does the media tell us? It tells us, for example, that we are awash in gun violence in this country. And if you turn on CNN over the past 30-some years, you will hear CNN telling us when gun violence gets worse. In 1993, gun violence was worse than it was in 1992, and that was the big news in 1993. Look at the gun violence that's going on in the United States. And then comes along 1994, and gun violence gets worse still. And so again, CNN and media outlets like this are telling us how bad the gun violence is. But then something interesting happens. In 1995, gun violence gets better. And the media doesn't report on that. They move on to something else because they know we want to hear bad news, so they don't have gun violence to talk about. That's not bad news this year. They'll talk about something else. And then come along 1996, same thing. gun violence got better, so they don't talk about gun violence, they talk about something else. And this goes on until you get to 2003, where gun violence got worse than it was in 2002, and this is the headline news. Gun violence gets worse. And this goes on and on and on over the course of 30-some years, so that the only thing we hear is when gun violence gets worse. And if you ask the average person, is gun violence worse or better in this country than in the past? Everybody pretty much says it's getting worse because we're repeating what we hear, but we're only hearing half of the story. So Pew Research, which is if you ever have if you're interested in looking at numbers, go online and look up Pew. They do all sorts of interesting surveys of Americans and what they think and these sorts of things. One of the things that they've done for almost 30 years now, they have asked Americans every single year, do you believe that gun violence in this country is worse or better than it was last year? And if you look at their data, in every single year from 1992 to the present, in every single year save 2, Americans reported, yeah, I believe gun violence is worse in this country than it was the year before. But if you look at the actual data, the gun violence was worse in only 1/3 of the years over the past 3 decades. 2/3 of the past 3 decades we have spent with gun violence getting better, not worse. And yet we believe that we're awash in gun violence. Now, you might say in response, all right, but maybe the bad years were really bad and the good years were just a little bit good, so that in total, gun violence really is getting worse. Well, we can go to the data here. And what you're seeing here are firearm homicides adjusted for population from 1993 to the present. And you can see them falling, kind of leveling off, going down a little bit more. The last year, because of COVID and all of that, we had an increase. But on average, that's a 2% decline per year from the 1990s. Firearm homicides in the U.S. Now, you might look at that and say, well, okay, maybe firearm homicides are going down, but people commit crimes with guns and maybe people don't die, or they're shot and injured, but they don't die, and so they're not showing up in this data. Yeah, we have a separate data set for that. That's the non-fatal firearm crime rate. And if you look at the non-fatal firearm crime rate, you see this. It actually improves even more at double the rate that the homicide firearm rate improves. Over the past 3 decades, guns have become progressively less and less of a problem, despite the fact that the media tells us it's becoming more and more. And of course, the big thing that the media loves to talk about is the death toll from mass shootings. You get a mass shooting and that's going to be on the news for 2 weeks. And the media is going to play it as much as they can because why? Because we like to see that. And we will turn on and see what the developments are. And every time we turn on and see the developments, that generates advertising dollars for the media. It gives them a profit incentive to keep showing us this. And if you look at the data, what do we see with homicides by mass shooting? From 1990s up to the present, you can see indeed they are increasing. These are deaths in the United States due to mass shootings. So the media, and I'm not claiming the media is lying, they are telling you the truth. Deaths from mass shootings are becoming a greater and greater problem in this country. But remember, the media is only telling you part of the truth. The part of the truth that's missing here is the context. Yes, the number of people killed from mass shootings in the U.S. is rising, but what about the number of people killed by other things? For example, knives. Now, I'm going to show you number of Americans killed by knives in the United States. I'm going to overlay it on top of this graph. So these blue bars you see, that's mass shootings, deaths by mass shootings. You're going to see orange bars. The orange bars are deaths in the United States due to knifings. These last 2 years, the knifing deaths are not zero. We just don't have data for these 2 years yet. The number of Americans killed by knifings in the U.S. is 15 times the number that are killed in mass shootings. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about mass shootings. Absolutely, we should be concerned about mass shootings. But if we are not, 15 times more concerned about deaths from knifings, then that indicates that there's some disconnect, that we're not understanding the context of the world we're living in. And so we'll have, every time there's a mass shooting, politicians come out and start talking about we're going to ban this or ban that, or we're going to have some kind of regulations, or these things need to be better enforced, or whatever it is. You don't hear anything about knifings like that. Now, you might respond and say something like, well, you really can't make that comparison because people use knives all the time. You can't be banning knives. Yes, you can. Any of you been to Spain? In Spain, it's illegal to own knives. There's a footnote. You can have kitchen knives provided they're not longer than 4 inches. But if you want anything more than that, if you have a butcher shop, you're at Subway and you use, the long knives, you have to get a license to use those. The big thing that the media made much of its money on over the past few years was COVID. And you know the story. Every night you get the news about how many people died today from COVID and all of this stuff. And this goes on and on. This was a bonanza for the media in terms of advertising dollars because Americans were completely fixated on number of people who are dying from COVID. This is at the height of COVID on an annualized basis. There were roughly 375,000 Americans dying on an annual basis. So think of it per year from COVID at the height of COVID. And so this is what you saw, is nonstop news about people who are dying from COVID. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about it. Of course we should be concerned about it. This is a truth. But to have a correct response to it, given that we have limited resources and limited attention spans and all of this, we need to put this truth in context. We have to put it into context of the truth that the media isn't telling us. And what isn't the media telling us? It's not telling us that the number of people who died annually from cancer and heart disease combined were more than double the number who died from COVID. We shut down schools because of this. We don't shut down schools or offices because of that. I mean, you all don't die of heart disease and cancer, but people in offices do. We don't talk about shutting down offices for this. Now, you might say in response, yeah, but you can't make that comparison because COVID was a communicable disease. Heart disease and cancer aren't. That's correct. But that argument actually goes the other direction. Because COVID is communicable, if we had done nothing, no vaccine, no social distancing, no masks, no nothing, lots of people would have died from COVID. But over a relatively short period of time, we would have developed immunity. And COVID, absent this huge spike when it first starts off, would have tailed off naturally. We would have developed immunity to it. Heart disease and cancer, you don't develop immunity to those. So if you similarly step back and do nothing about these, this doesn't go away. Year after year after year after year, you'll keep getting this. So the truth that the media was telling us, people dying from COVID, absolutely correct. The truth the media wasn't telling us was the context of how many more people die from this other thing. And if we're going to be concerned about COVID, and I think absolutely we should be concerned about COVID, we should be at least 2 times as concerned about heart disease and cancer. If you take economists' estimates on how much the United States spent in terms of lost GDP in actual dollars that we physically spent on fighting COVID, with that much money, we could have increased funding to the National Cancer Institute by around 3,000%. That we chose the one and not the other does not indicate that we made a mistake with COVID. It does indicate that our attentions are skewed. We're looking at this thing over here and not looking at this other thing that's actually worse. And why are we doing that? Because the media is only showing this one thing. And why is it only showing us one thing? Because that's what we want. That's what entertains us, the bad news. And so if you track, go back and look sometime at the headlines from March to May of 2020. And the headlines were all about COVID deaths. This is what the media was telling us. How many people died of COVID? On the evening news, they come on, they have a number up there. This many people today died of COVID, and on and on. And what happened is an interesting thing. Round about the end of May 2020, the number of deaths from COVID started to decline. And because the number of deaths from COVID started to decline, it was no longer bad news. And what the media did is it switched. It stopped talking about COVID deaths and it started talking about COVID infections. And if you look at the headlines from June to September of 2020, you'll see so many of the news media no longer talking about deaths, but talking about infections. Because although the deaths were going down, the infections were going up. And they could now point to that and say, look at this bad news. More and more people being infected by COVID. And then around about September of 2020, when the infections started to go down, again the media shifted, and now they started talking about COVID cases. That's anybody who has or had in the past COVID. And that number can only go up by definition. Then round about March of 2021, people got tired of hearing about the COVID cases because the case in business is as scary of a word as the deaths. And the media discovered a new thing it could talk about: deaths with COVID. Now that with is interesting. It's not deaths from COVID, it's deaths with COVID. This includes people who actually died of COVID, but it also includes, for example, someone who died in an automobile accident and later was discovered that person had COVID. That person goes into this data set, deaths with COVID. So you can see the media shifting as the news is no longer bad here, we shift to that, we shift to this, and this now becomes, it's not as scary as the other things, so we shift to this. The media is constantly shifting, trying to keep your attention, because as long as it has your attention, it has your time, it can sell to advertisers, and it gets dollars from them because you're watching. Wage stagnation is something you hear about often from the media, most often during election cycles, that wages are stagnating. And here's the actual data from 1979 up to the present. This is real median annual wages. So think of this as it's the guy in the middle. If you line up everybody from the low wage to the high wage, the guy in the middle, and real means adjusted for inflation. So inflation's not an issue here. And you can see it's gone up about 8% since 1979. And you notice 1979 is a peak year. If you go from the 1980s, it's up about 18%. This is real median annual wages. And here, the media kind of stretches it a bit. Real wages haven't stagnated. They are up a bit, but 8%, 18%, that's not a lot to talk about over the course of whatever that is. Good God, 30, 40 years, right? That's all true, what you're seeing there. What the media will not tell you, what politicians absolutely will not tell you, is that workers aren't paid wages. They're paid compensation. Compensation is the combination of wages and employer-paid benefits. That is the employer's contribution to your health insurance, to your retirement fund. All of that's part of your employment package. It's something the employer pays you. If you look at compensation, everything workers earn, that's up almost 60%. And that's 60% above inflation. Real compensation, median compensation, is up almost 60% more than inflation since 1979. That's the part the media isn't telling you. Why? It's good news. Nobody wants to hear that. We'd like to hear the thing on the other side. And when we're talking about income, of course, the thing you keep hearing repeated is that the middle class is disappearing. You hear this often. The middle class is disappearing. It used to be that we're all middle class, and now there's not many middle class people. I'm going to show you the actual numbers on this. And what you're seeing here, this is income across the bottom. So this is high income over here, low income over there. And it's all adjusted for inflation, right? So inflation's not an issue here. I'm going to divide these incomes into the three groups that we typically talk about: the poor, the middle class, and the rich. And I'm going to show you a bunch of bars, and the bar is the fraction of U.S. households in each income category. So for example, here's 1970. In 1970, 16% of U.S. households were earning what today we would call $35,000 to $50,000. In 1970, 24% of households were earning what today we would call $50,000 to $75,000. And 14% of households were earning what we would call today 75 to 100,000. That's, in 1970, that's the middle class. 53% of us were middle class in 1970. And if you do the same thing for the poor, you find that 1/3 of us were poor in 1970 and 14% of us were rich. That's the distribution of household income in the United States in 1970. Now, I'm going to move time forward. And as I move time forward, watch what happens to these bars. There's a very clear trend here. If you look at the middle class, the fraction of households in this category dropped. Fraction of households in this category dropped. This category dropped. This is the middle class. In 1970, 53% of us were middle class, and now only 40% of us are. The media is telling us the truth. The middle class is indeed shrinking. But what the media doesn't tell you, and is happy for you to assume, is that if the middle class is shrinking, it must be because we're getting poor. That's bad news. Yeah, except look at the poor classes. Over the same period of time, the fraction of us who were poor fell from 33% to 26%. Where did all these households go? They went into the rich categories. In 1970, 14% of us were in the rich categories. Today, 34% of us are in the rich categories. Yes, the middle class is shrinking. So too are the poor classes. That's really good news. But that's not news that sells advertising. And so you only hear the first part. The middle class is shrinking. Whenever we talk about things like income, eventually somebody comes around to saying, well, the problem here really is that the rich aren't paying their fair share. You hear this often, and much more so during election time, but this is a thing that, of course, you've heard people like to say. One of the things that fascinates me is whenever somebody says the rich need to pay their fair share, or the rich aren't paying their fair share, and you have lots of discussion about this, you talk about how much they're earning and all this stuff, nobody ever answers the question, what's fair? How do I know if they're paying their fair share if you're not going to tell me what fair is? Nobody talks about that. So, what I've done over the past 20 years is I've asked students across the country from high school all the way up to graduate school. I asked them all the same question. I showed them a chart like this, and this says, look, the poorest 20% of households in the US earn $16,000 roughly. The middle 20% earn about $62,000. The top 1%, the average household in the top 1% is earning about $2 million. This is what they're actually earning. By the way, this is market income, meaning it's income derived from market activities. So think about wages, interest, capital gains, all that stuff. It's no government handouts here, it's strictly market income. And I ask students, tell me, what do you think is fair? There's no right or wrong answer here. You could think about this as I'm saying this. What do you think is fair? No right or wrong answer, just your gut feeling. What do you say is fair? And when I ask you about what is a fair tax rate, what I mean is, after you have done all of your accounting and legal gymnastics to reduce your taxes as much as possible, at the end, when all the dust settles, how much are you actually paying? What fraction of your income are you actually paying to the IRS? Tell me what you think is fair. And so, as you imagine, I get all kinds of different answers, but a remarkable amount of agreement. Students across the board, from high school up through graduate school, most of them, I shouldn't say most, but the plurality of them will say about 5% for the poor. 5% is fair. And when I ask about the middle class, most of them will say 15%. 15% of your income, this is federal government only, to the federal government, that's fair. And then when I ask about the top 1%, once in a while I'll get a crazy person who says 100% or another crazy person who says 0, but most people, in fact, there's the most agreement of all about this one. People come in at around 30%. This just seems to be kind of at a majority level what people think at a gut level is fair, 5, 15, 30%. Now, here's the thing. Let's look at how much taxes these three groups actually pay. And again, this is what you're actually paying after you've done your deductions and exemptions and write-offs and all that stuff. The average poorest household pays around $300 in federal tax. The average middle income about $11,000, and the top 1% $620,000. And if you do the math, taxes divided by income, people right now are pretty much paying what students are saying is fair. And this kind of explains to me why nobody, at least in the major media, stops to ask what is fair. Because if you stop to ask what is fair, the answer you would get is, well, pretty much what's going on now. Except this isn't the whole story, because I've left out of here an important source of income. That is what you get from the federal government. We call it federal transfers. This is the government literally cutting a check to people. It's not tax rebates. Tax rebate is you paid too much and now you're going to settle with the IRS. It's not that. It's the government is going to cut you a check. Comes in the form of income assistance, the earned income tax credit, some housing credits, things like this. And if you look at the numbers, the poorest 20% receive, on average, $20,000 per household in federal transfers. Middle-income Americans receive around $17,000 on average. The top 1% get $13,000. You might ask the question, why is the top 1% getting anything from the government? Social Security retirement benefits are included here. That's the government cutting you a check for something. So here's what these three groups end up with after you subtract the taxes they pay and add back the transfers they're getting. This is how they end up when they're all done dealing with the federal government. And if you ask the question now, what fraction of your income have you lost to the federal government, accounting both for taxes that the government took and transfers, money the government gave you back? What you find is that the typical household in the poorest 20% is being taxed at negative 126%. That is, they're receiving back from the government more than they pay in, so that they're actually better off at the end. The typical middle-income household is paying about negative 3%. They're also, on average, receiving somewhat more back from the government than they're paying. The top 1%, they're around 31%. And here you see an interesting phenomenon. Every time we talk about tax cuts in this country, somebody says, well, you mean tax cuts for the rich. Yeah, that's the truth. We do mean tax cuts for the rich. The other half of the truth that nobody's telling you is that tax cuts are almost always tax cuts for the rich because that's pretty much the only people who are paying. The middle class and the poor, there are exceptions, but these are the averages that you're seeing. On average, the middle class and the poor aren't paying taxes. So you can cut their taxes and nothing happens there. Perhaps the most insidious half-truth that the media will tell you is that all of these problems that we're encountering are due to capitalism, what economists like to call free markets. The real problem here is capitalism. We get rid of that and all these problems I've shown you start to go away. All right, I'm going to show you some data that deals with economic freedom. And economists use this term economic freedom because capitalism comes with so much baggage. In terms of economics, it's almost become a useless term. So people say to me things like, well, the problem with capitalism is companies are free to pollute. That's not capitalism, not in the sense of economics. In economics, capitalism means, amongst other things, the freedom to do what you want, provided you aren't imposing harm on someone else. Well, pollution violates that footnote. Yeah, doing whatever I want is polluting, but it's harming somebody else. It's antithetical to what economists would think of when they think of capitalism. So we step away from that term. In economists, you'll find them using this term economic freedom, which means what I just said, the ability to do whatever it is you want, provided you aren't imposing harm on someone else. Let's look at the relationship between economic freedom and income. And what I'm going to do here is take all the countries of the world and divide them into two groups. The less economically free, the more economically free. And I want to ask, what are their levels of income in these two groups? And the numbers you're going to see are adjusted for differences in cost of living. So yes, it's cheaper to live in Mexico than it is in the US. We take that into account when we compare the two incomes. So think of it as cost of living adjusted income. Less economically free, more economically free. if you look at the countries of the world, the more economically free countries have substantially higher income levels. And you might say in response, yeah, but I know what's going on here. It's the people in the rich countries, they have the leisure to be concerned about things like economic freedom. It's not that economic freedom causes riches, it's that riches cause economic freedom. The causality goes the other direction. That's a reasonable counter-argument. One way to address it is to say, okay, let's get rid of the rich countries. In fact, let's get rid of the middle-class countries too. Let's look only at the poor. I'm now going to show you the same picture, but looking only at the poorest countries on the planet. If you take the poorest countries on the planet and you divide them into these two groups, the less economically free, the more economically free, what you see is the same phenomenon. Even amongst the poor countries, the more economically free have higher incomes than the less economically free. What about income inequality? Because, again, the counter-argument is, okay, maybe you've got higher income, but you've got to have a higher disparity as well. There's going to be more income inequality amongst these economically free countries. Economists measure income inequality with something we call the Gini Coefficient. Higher number means more income inequality. So again, I'm going to take all the countries of the world, divide them into two groups, the less economically free, the more economically free, and ask, what are your Gini coefficients? How much income inequality is there? And you find the income inequality is less. Now, what you will hear from the media is that the problem with capitalism is that you get income inequality. That is absolutely correct. It is true. With capitalism, you will get income inequality. What the media won't tell you is the other half of the truth, which is, without capitalism, the income inequality is even worse. Poverty, same kind of thing. You get less poverty with economic freedom. Child labor, less child labor with economic freedom. And what the counter-argument here is, well, what happens is these economically free countries will simply export their child labor, right? Having children work in your factory is great. They've got little hands. They can get into places that adults can't. They're not good at negotiating labor contracts. They don't eat that much. You don't have to pay them much. I would love to have children working in my factory, but I'm in a big, rich country. We have laws against that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a factory in a poor country, preferably an economically free country, one that doesn't have these pesky child labor laws. I'll exploit their children. If that story I told you is true, then when we look at the poorest countries, we should see higher child labor amongst the economically free and lower child labor amongst the less economically free. And in fact, that's not what you see at all. Yes, the child labor rates are high. These are poor countries, but the same pattern. Less child labor amongst the economically free poor countries, more child labor amongst the economically unfree poor countries. Human development, this is a measure from the UN. It asks the questions about quality of life, higher quality of life. This is coming from the UN, right? This is not some right-wing organization talking about quality of life. It's the United Nations. If you cross-reference their data with economic freedom, you find this. More economically free countries exhibit more human development, better quality of life of the people. The environmental outcomes are better. This is atmospheric pollution. This is forestation. All better in the economically free countries. And you look at all of this stuff and you should be left with this question, so what? Remember, the media is a profit-driven entity. It's looking for dollars. The dollars come from advertisers. The advertisers come from viewers. And where do the viewers come from? They come from bad news. The media is not going to lie to you, but it's not going to tell you the whole truth either. It's going to tell you the truth you have chosen that you want to hear. You've chosen by your behavior. And what do we want to hear? We want to hear this bad news. And so you get the bad news. That's what you asked for. Like any business, it's going to deliver what the customer wants. And the sad part about this is one of the pieces of half-truths you'll get is that the problems that we live with come from free markets, when in fact, the evidence is quite clear that free markets are the cure to the problems, not the source. If you've enjoyed this, I have a weekly podcast, Words and Numbers, where I and my colleague, who's a political scientist, every week we talk about stuff that's going on in the world from the eyes of an economist and political scientist. And we have this wonderful book that you should all buy, Cooperation and Coercion, where we talk about what's going on in the world, again, as seen from the viewpoints of political science and economics. We have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and line up along this wall and state your name and what school you go to.
I'm short. Hi, is this on? Oh, fantastic. My name is Ava Philippek, and I go to South River High School near Annapolis, Maryland. And I was wondering, like, what your go-to news site is for your information.
My go-to what?
Like news work.
Oh,
network,
news. Yeah, good question, Ava. Problem here is nobody's going to tell you everything. So my technique is I pick a reputable what I'll say quote unquote right wing, a reputable right wing news source and a reputable left wing news source, and watch both of them. And if you're into newspapers, my top choices are Wall Street Journal and New York Times. If you want something more audio, NPR is quite good. And oddly, and I haven't listened to them in a number of years, but at least as of maybe 5-10 years ago, NPR's Planet Money was pretty straight up economically accurate. Yeah, so I would do that. Look for things on both sides and look at both of them. Understand, these people are not lying to you, right? I mean, there are news outlets that will lie to you, but the mainstream ones are not lying to you, but they are telling you what they think you want to hear because they want you to come back so they can sell advertising. So get both perspectives.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure.
Hey, how are you? My name is Fernando Perez. I'm homeschooled, and my question for you is: why do people like to hear negativity?
Why they like to hear negativity? Oh,
yeah.
Because it's exciting. It gets our blood boiling, right? Why? I don't. It's a matter of preference, right? De gustibus non disputantum. It's.
But like over positivity, like why? Like other than like it's exciting, sure, but like. Why isn't positivity delivered more, or at least a positive side of some stories? Like,
because it's boring. I mean, you could say it's look. When I first discovered Good News Network, because I was doing the same, I was complaining. Look at all this bad news out here, and I found goodnewsnetwork.org. And it was serious news, and I'm reading this stuff like every day. I'm reading it, and I suddenly realized, oh my God, this is so boring. I went back to CNN. Right? Why? I don't know why. It's a psychological question. Why is it that humans like the bad stuff? We like the bad stuff. Why do we like scary movies and murder movies and all this stuff? It's titillating.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davies, for taking the time to speak with us today. So it sounds kind of like these media outlets are, working within the free market to provide the audience with what will generate money for them. So they're, working within the incentive structure of a free enterprise economy. So we can't really put blame on them for kind of doing that. So how can we try to change the news and inspire it to become more honest and positive?
That's a really good question. We have to identify the problem. The problem isn't the media. The problem isn't the advertisers. The problem isn't the profit incentive. What's the problem? Us. We're the problem. Markets are simply tools. They deliver things that we want. And what we want is this. I don't think we should be wanting that. Now, be very careful, because if you start saying things like, well, people shouldn't want that, we should have some rules in place to adjust this so that we get balanced news. Okay, you just took a huge step away from free markets, because the next thing that happens is somebody else is going to say, you know what? These types of cars that people are driving, they shouldn't want to drive the types of cars they're driving. They should want to drive these other cars. Let's do the same thing with the car industry that we just did with the media. What about health insurance? I don't like the types of health insurance people are buying. They should be buying these other ones. Let's do that. And all of a sudden now, you have a very different world than one of economic freedom. An economy is like a political system. A political system will give you, a democratic system will give you the government you ask for. We can all complain about our friends here in Washington. And who do we have to blame for that? Ourselves. We're the ones who elected them. So too with markets. If you don't like what markets are producing, look to the consumers. If it's a free market, it's the consumer's fault.
Thank you.
My name is Tyler Allen. I'm from Colorado. So my question is, why would media sites push, or some media sites push, a socialist agenda?
Why would they push a socialist agenda? Well, so I'll give you two answers here. One is ideologically driven. That is, that I have a news site and that's my ideology and that's what I want to push, right? Those, I think, tend to be more marginal players. The mainstream players are, again, they're looking for advertising dollars. What brings in the advertising dollars? Well, we've got a clientele who like the socialist message. So that's what we're going to promote. Why is it that some car companies sell electric cars? Well, because their customers are looking for that sort of thing. And again, the story comes back to us. What is it that we want? And I want to expand, because you're now stepping on to the answer I gave last time. I want to give a little bit more about this, about blaming the consumer. When I say I blame the consumer, I don't mean for the story to end there, that, well, we're all getting what we deserve and that's it. No. Markets are a tool that human beings in community use to achieve certain ends. We need to think better about how we can live together in community, be more responsible, be better citizens, be better friends and neighbors to the people around us, to be better people. We make ourselves better people, and the markets will respond. They'll give us what we want. So this is not a story of, well, there's just no solution here, we're the problem. It's a story of, there is a solution. We, the problem, are also the solution. We look to bettering ourselves, and bettering ourselves, markets will give us different things.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, this will be our final question.
Hello, my name is James Tebow. I'm from the state of New Hampshire. I guess sort of the point of your last question, is the collapse of CNN Plus and the restructuring of CNN, which is one of the major news sources, a good sign that our news media may be on a better track for the future?
Yeah, I don't know the particulars of CNN, but I do get the sense that people have had enough. We've seen, and I think if there was something that pushed us over the edge, I get the sense it was COVID. We went through however many, 18 months or more of this nonstop bad news, which we discovered from our own experience wasn't false, but it wasn't the whole story either. Yes, people were dying of COVID, but it wasn't it was a big deal, but it wasn't the big deal, the huge deal that the media made it out to be. And I think we all got a dose of healthy skepticism. And so we may be, and again, I don't know the particulars of CNN, but we may be asking different things now of our media than we asked before. And I think you'll see it playing out in the major media. I think you'll start to see it playing out in social media as well. I spend a tremendous amount of time on social media promoting my podcast that you should all listen to and my book you should all read. And I have found that for the cesspit that social media is, it does seem to be getting better. People seem to be getting a little bit nicer, a little bit more tolerant of each other, a little bit more willing to listen. And I think that comes from all of us, or most of us at some point, saying we've had enough. There's got to be a better way to do this.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.